Is it working now? Is that the volume on the phone?
That's the volume.
All right. Can you check it?
Yeah.
Hopefully we have the volume figured out.
Volume.
Just that's all the candies you get, no more. Whole sucking 2 suckers at once.
Okay, say
1, 2. Hey, can you hear me now?
I can hear it.
Yeah, see? There we go. All right, so we got the little audio figured out. Sorry about that. So, as I was saying, the backdrop to the First Crusade is the alliance, first the alliance of 1059 between Rome and the Norman leader, Robert Guiscard. Remember, the Normans had been coming into southern Italy, taking territory that had been part of the Roman Empire based in Constantinople. And this was a difficulty that the Roman Empire based in Constantinople faced. But the Bishop of Rome and the Bishop of Rome himself had gone out to war. Leo IX had actually gone to battle against the Normans. But by 1059, they had struck up an alliance, Rome and the Normans. And again, because the Bishop of Rome also is the head of the Papal States, he is a temporal, in a sense, sovereign at this point. And so this agreement meant that the Normans would, in a sense, support the Bishop of Rome, in a sense, against the imperial wishes of the Holy Roman Empire, meaning the one that would encompass most of modern day Germany, not the one based in Constantinople. Because it was those emperors of the Holy Roman Empire that had been choosing the bishops of Rome. And it's again in 1059 when this alliance is made that the current Pope, Nicholas II, makes the declaration that no bishop of Rome will be elected except from the council or the College of Cardinals. And so, but it's because they have Norman backing, in a sense, or Norman muscle, you could say, that they feel strong enough to make that declaration, in a sense, against the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire based in the German principalities. Norman conquest is then given papal blessing, and the Normans pledge themselves as vassals to the Bishop of Rome. So the Normans, meaning the ones in southern Italy, pledge themselves to be vassals of the Bishop of Rome. And so they eventually take all of the southern Italian peninsula by 1071. And the hope was to take the Balkan Peninsula and then Constantinople. In the same year of 1071, the Battle of Manzikert occurs in what is now modern-day Turkey. And this is the Roman Empire based in Constantinople that suffers this defeat at the Battle of Manzikert. And from this point on, the Constantinopolitan Empire is in decline. It never recovers from this, from the Muslim armies coming from the east and the Norman armies coming from the west. They're in a continual state of being pressed on two sides. And so the emperor of Constantinople, the Roman Emperor of Constantinople, Alexis I Comnenus, who rules from 1081 to 1118, and I have his name here, is in a very difficult position when he comes to power in 1081. And the bigger threat is from the east, though. And so Alexis requests in 1095, in March of 1095, he requests at a papal synod in Piacenza a limited number of knights from the west to come and assist him in his fight against the Turkish armies coming from the east. And at this point, what we see is that the east is weakening under Muslim pressure and also Norman pressure, and the west is strengthening because the west is not seeing incursions from Muslim armies into the mainland of Europe anymore. That stopped. That hadn't happened for several hundred years. Spain still, southern Spain is still occupied or controlled, is a Muslim caliphate. But portions of northern Spain are controlled by Christians, and it's a slow process. Well, they'll be battling back and forth, but that doesn't cross over the mountains, the Pyrenees Mountains, into what is modern day France or mainland, the rest of the mainland of Europe. So the rest of the mainland of Europe, Western Europe, there are no more incursions from the Huns coming from the east through modern day Russia and so forth. That has stopped. So there is no threat from that part of the east, and the Roman Empire of Constantinople is holding in check the Muslim empire kingdoms, the Turkish Empire, pushing in from the east, and so the West is kind of insulated at this point, and therefore able to strengthen militarily and economically and politically for the next number of hundreds of years. Whereas at the east, the Roman Empire in Constantinople will just continue to weaken until its collapse in 1453. In the east, including the Orthodox areas of Eastern Europe, they would face repeated external aggression throughout their history in the subsequent centuries, but the West would be spared. This includes when we start talking about Russia, the Russian Empire of the 12th, 13th, 14th century. They're the ones who are checking the Mongols invading, and they're not pressing further into Central or Western Europe. And so they're bearing the brunt of that movement from Mongolia. And so these periodic invasions of the East would result in the Orthodox Christian isolation from Europe in the coming centuries. And so that's the backdrop to what's going on. Also, the question of holy war. And that's what I put here. This is the question that arises at this time. And the question surrounds the use of arms. Can you fight? Is it right to fight or to kill, to shed blood? In the pre-imperial period, before Constantine, this was clearly seen as a contradiction, to take up arms and to kill, to fight in the army in the sense of an aggressive war. It was clearly seen as contradictory to the faith, that you should not shed innocent blood or shed blood as a soldier in service to kind of the pagan Roman state. This was many of the fathers thought that this was not blessed. But when the empire embraces the church, in the sense the church begins the process of baptizing the empire, the question gets more complicated. And so by the time of St. Augustine in the 400s, this question is being addressed. And for St. Augustine, war, as well as, this is his opinion, as well as the fathers before him, as well as those in the East, war was sinful. Period. War was sinful. But St. Augustine said it was permissible in self-defense and to avenge the wrong perpetrated by others. He also said that war could be waged against heretics by God's command. So these are Christians who had gone into heresy and were expressing or spreading heretical beliefs. So he said that war could be waged against them. Force used to suppress theological error or force sectarians to abandon heresy was permissible. Force was universally seen as not being acceptable when it was directed against unbelievers for the sake of converting them. So conversion by force was universally seen as forbidden, since you couldn't force somebody to be baptized, or you couldn't force a civilization to be baptized, or a tribe or city. But even that came into question. Gregory I encouraged war against pagans as a means of evangelization in the 6th century in the West. And then in the West, by the 9th century, as we had noted, popes themselves took up the defense of Rome. And clerical participation in warfare was not seen as unusual. Feudal society in the West was very violent. There were several attempts to try to bring, in a sense, a more peaceful nature to the culture, and several kind of movements called the Peace of God and the Truce of God were attempted, and these were all kind of trying to put rules and regulations around when you could fight. You know, you couldn't fight on Sunday, you couldn't fight during the fast, and so forth. You couldn't fight. Christians couldn't fight between themselves without certain exceptions to that or certain reasons. All this was an attempt to decrease the violence within society, but they weren't very successful. Attempts were then also made at focusing the violence, not just stopping it, but focusing it. And so war in service of the poor and the defenseless. The church declares knighthood as a vocation, in a sense that this could be your life's work, is being a knight. And that being a knight could be a calling that was well-pleasing to God, that God was happy or would bless someone's, in a sense, taking up the role of a knight. Just like a doctor would be seen as a blessed vocation. A knight would be seen also on that same kind of level. And so you have this development of a Christian knighthood for which the church then sanctioned war was a religious duty. And this developed in the West into even monastic forms of knighthood that would emerge in the Crusading period and so forth. The Gregorian reformers of the 11th century are the ones who developed the idea of a holy war. And this is directed against initially Islamic invasion in the West that had come into Sicily, into the island of Sicily. And soldiers who died fighting Islamic expansion were seen as martyrs for the faith in the West. But holy war, Christian knighthood as an order or a blessed vocation, war on behalf of the church or war sanctioned by the Pope or a bishop, all of these things were alien concepts in the East. Soldiers who shed blood on the battlefield could not receive communion for 3 years. Soldiers who died in battle were not included as martyrs. And even one of the emperors in the East requested that some of his fellow soldiers in his unit or troop who had died fighting, since is either the Persians or the Turkish armies, non-Christian, pagan armies, in defense of a Christian empire, he had requested that they be included as martyrs. And the hierarchs of the church said no. So this idea of holy war was unknown in the East. Clergy were forbidden to participate in bloodshed. Those who did were deposed or excommunicated. And the same applied to monks. Monks and clergy were forbidden to fight or even to carry weapons, which is still the common practice in the Orthodox Church today. The priest is not allowed to own something that is a weapon used for killing. So that applies to all sharp objects or things that send out projectiles. Yes, Paul, question.
Fishing rods.
This does not apply to fish. Fishing rods are not for
And the hook.
the fishing rods and fishing hooks are not used for combating fellow human beings.
They could be. The hooks would be sharp enough.
That's not their intention, though. The thing, a priest is not allowed to own something that's its intention is for bloodshed. Fishing pole does not fall into that category. But good question. Good question.
But they just use
Okay. So the church itself would not sanction the shedding of blood. You have a clear idea that for the empire to defend itself from aggression is, in a sense, something that is allowed. And even the church doesn't bless it per se, or sanction it, but the church prays for the empire to be able to defend itself for the protection of the innocent people, for the people within the empire, right? This was permissible. This was understandable. But in many ways, the empire did not go on expansionary movement in its Christian period. The Roman Empire, in a sense, does not go beyond its borders that it finds itself at the height of the pagan period. In the East, the Roman Empire does not exist in an expansionary way. The territory it takes in any kind of conflict is only the retaking of its own territory. And so this idea, especially of clergy taking up arms in battle, is something completely foreign, but had become commonplace or usual in the West. And this all is the background to how the Crusades come about and why they themselves become so divisive. So there's a question, are religious people permitted to hunt for survival? Lay people are allowed to hunt. Priests are not allowed to hunt.
Are there exceptions in Alaska?
The exception doesn't make the rule. Yeah, there's an exception for clergy in Alaska, but that doesn't define the rule. In general, clergy are not allowed to take the life of anything. I should say, people or mammals, right? Fishing is a different category of creature, and so fishing is permitted. The apostles were fishermen, I guess. Maybe that's partly why. But so in general, priests don't hunt. But lay people are allowed to hunt. Hunting is not forbidden. So I hope that answers that. So in terms of religious relations, or I should say relations between the churches, East and West, before 1095, there is no clear break of communion East and West. Pilgrims from the West who would come to the East for pilgrimage, whether that was to Jerusalem or to Constantinople or anywhere in the East, were able to receive communion like everybody else. They were not turned away. Monastic communities such as Cluny and Monte Cassino in the West had friendly relations with other monasteries in the East up to this point. The sense that there was a need for liturgical uniformity in terms of practice was not seen as essential. This was not something that people were beating the drum over, per se. At a synod of 1089, in Constantinople, Pope Urban II, who is the Pope who calls for the crusade, the First Crusade, he's elected Pope, I believe, in 1088. He sends a legate to Constantinople and asks why his name is not mentioned in the diptychs. The diptychs are the lists of the hierarchs of the churches that are in communion with each other, and they would be that the name of those hierarchs would be listed out in liturgy at a patriarchal liturgy in Constantinople, and so the Bishop of Rome's name traditionally would be mentioned first, because there was a hierarchy of who was mentioned when. First Rome, then Constantinople, then Alexandria, then Antioch, then Jerusalem. And that was the diptychs. But from 1054, they stopped mentioning the Pope. And so, because of the issues surrounding that time, which we covered in 2 lectures ago. So Urban asks why his name is not mentioned, because he's Pope. And so a synod is held in Constantinople, and a search is done of the synodal records, and there is no record of a judgment of break in communion that they find having been kept. And so Constantinople says, well, we don't know why this is going on, why you're not being mentioned, but please send us the customary letter announcing your official election as Pope of Rome, as you normally would do historically, along with your confession of faith, and that would announce to us that you were elected, and then we will add your name to the diptychs. The Pope never responds. He never responds, and we don't know exactly why, but the conjecture is, or if he did, it's lost. But the conjecture is sending the letter would mean that the other patriarchs would judge the Bishop of Rome's orthodoxy in his confession of faith. And that in a sense, there was this kind of confirmation of one another amongst the Petarchy, the 5 major patriarchates, the 5 major bishops in the Roman world, the Orthodox, or the Christian world at this time, and that they would traditionally announce their election one to another, and each would confirm it. But that would put the Bishop of Rome on par, on the same level with the other patriarchs. But that's not what the Bishop of Rome had asserted under the Gregorian reforms, and not what the Bishop of Rome, Urban II, would, in a sense, want to, submit to. And so no letter seemingly was sent or received, and therefore his name was never added to the diptychs, because he didn't follow through with what traditionally would have been done. But from the side of Constantinople, they couldn't find a reason why his name wasn't mentioned. So at this point, in the early part of 1095, there is no clear schism in place. That is, in a sense, insurmountable. Whatever difficulties there are, which are apparent, that there are some problems, it wasn't seen as this was impossible to deal with. And so again, in March of 1095, Alexis I, Emperor of Constantinople, of the Roman Empire in Constantinople, asks for military aid from the West, from the Pope. As the Pope Urban II. Yes. Who had earlier, in 1089, asked, why is my name not on the diptychs? So in November of 1095, Pope Urban II, November 27th of 1095, he preaches what's called the First Crusade. Urban's aim was to aid Emperor Alexis in the retaking of territory of the Roman Empire based in Constantinople. What's novel is one, he's preaching for, in a sense, a military campaign. The Pope is preaching for a military campaign. And this idea, there had been this tradition of pilgrimage to the east, to the Holy Land. So holy sites. People would take pilgrimage to Rome. They would take pilgrimage to Constantinople, to Jerusalem, to Antioch, all the important holy cities in the east as well as the west. But when you went on pilgrimage, it was a spiritual, in a sense, journey. And it was traditional that you didn't carry weapons, that you went unarmed, that this was, not a conflict per se, but you went, this was, in a sense, an act of devotion. And so what is novel in Urban's preaching of the First Crusade is he joins together religious pilgrimage with holy war. That he frames this as a pilgrimage to the east, but you're taking arms with you. And this is a novel. Even for the West, this is a novel idea. An armed pilgrimage. So, and that you also would receive, in a sense, the same spiritual benefit that pilgrims, it was understood that when you went on pilgrimage, this was a spiritual exercise, it was an act of devotion, it was a means of expressing, of seeking repentance often for your sins, that you were, in a sense, a time of soul searching as you traveled, because, you went largely either by boat or by foot on these journeys, and you would be in church often, you would make your confession and so forth, and that this was a spiritual exercise. But he linked the same sense of spiritual benefit to pilgrimage to holy war. And that this was a new, in a sense, this is a new preaching, a new way to salvation. No one had, in a sense, preached this before. The knight before would have to, traditionally the knight who had been involved in war would set aside his knighthood. He would make a monastic profession sometimes and spend the rest of his life in repentance, sorting out the things that he had been involved with, and in a sense, doing good in order to, in a sense, make amends for what he had done, or to try to repair the damage he had done to society by the things that he had done that he could see that were wrong, or he would go on pilgrimage, unarmed pilgrimage, to seek repentance for the sins that he had committed as a knight, as a soldier. Now he need not to lay aside violence at all. And crusading was presented as a way of seeking remission of sins and entry into heaven. If you take up the cross, right, eventually this is how it's referred to. Crusading, taking up the cross, that you would bear the cross on you as a soldier, right? And we all know the movies, right? You can all think of the theatrical examples of this. And that this would be a means of receiving indulgence or for your sins, of remission of your sins. This is how it was presented in the West. This was completely alien and bonkers to the mind of the Easterner, this idea. So Urban's aim in 1095 was relief of the churches of God in the eastern regions, but this was soon disregarded by those who actually went on crusade. What occurred eventually was the start of what we could call ecclesiastical colonialism. Alexis, Patriarch or Emperor Alexis, had asked for a limited number of men at arms, but he was sent an army. It's an army of pilgrims, and not a very organized army at that. And when Alexis was presented with this situation of vast numbers of just ordinary people on pilgrimage in a sense, but carrying along whatever weapons they could find, pillaging their fellow Christians sometimes on the way as they were going to fight the infidel, as they saw him. In the East, in the Holy Land, he tried to make the best of it. He tried to extract from them oaths of allegiance to him, and from the nobility who led the kind of this disorganized army. He made them swear oaths that whatever they did, whatever territory they retook, it would be returned to the empire, to the Roman emperor. And he was successful in receiving oaths from everyone involved who was of a noble standing, but all of them eventually broke their oaths. The cities of Edessa and Antioch were taken before 1098. So the city of Antioch, the mother church of our patriarchate, the Patriarchate of Antioch, it's that city of Antioch where they were first called Christians, along with the city of Edessa and the surrounding regions. And the territory was not returned to Alexis, to the Roman Empire in Constantinople, but was immediately turned into kingdoms of the Crusaders, the Crusader kingdoms. Many of these nobles were Norman themselves, Norman nobility, and they set up their own kingdoms in those places. In the midst of the crusade, there was a papal legate, so a representative of the Pope went on crusade with the Crusaders, who was a bishop, and his presence restrained any changes to the churches that the Crusaders, in a sense, freed from Islamic control. His name was Adhemar, and he himself acknowledged the rightful hierarchs of Edessa and of Antioch, of Jerusalem, as being the Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch, or the Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem, or the Metropolitan of Edessa, the Orthodox Metropolitan, the ones who were there, who were already, living in those places and amongst their own clergy and their own faithful. But Adhemar suddenly dies in 1098, and after his death, the Norman nobles' attitude towards the Orthodox changes. Latin clergy were installed in place of Orthodox hierarchs in Antioch and Edessa, and eventually in Jerusalem. Monastics and parish clergy were forced to swear obedience to the Latin hierarchs. And all of this would take place in Jerusalem when it was conquered in 1099. Anna Marie, pull out the power cord and plug it in. For the Crusaders, who were the ones actually doing the fighting, Christendom in their mind was synonymous with Latin Christianity from the West. And everything else was seen as heretical, unfortunately. The new papal legate who arrived from Rome, Daimbert, 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 did not share his predecessor's view of those, but those of the Normans who were doing the fighting. He himself eventually would be made Patriarch of Jerusalem in place, in a sense, of an Orthodox hierarch from that church. The Patriarch Jerusalem had been living in Cyprus for a time in exile, but he died in the midst of all of this, and he was replaced with a Latin cleric, who then was replaced with Daimbert. The Orthodox clergy were driven out of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and many of the episcopal sees in the territories conquered by the Crusaders. Most of the Patriarchate of Jerusalem's property was annexed by the Crusaders, meaning it was taken and seized by the Crusaders. The Crusader states became an apartheid state, as we would understand it today, with those who were of Latin, in a sense, Latin or Western, or what we might think of as Frankish descent, coming from the Frankish empires, or the Normans being included in this, that they were a privileged class above everyone else. And that even legally, their legal standing was superior to anyone else. This did not just affect the Orthodox Christians. Muslims and Jews also were not treated very well. And this poor treatment in the Holy Land would translate into acts of anti-Semitism, especially in the Rhineland, in what is modern-day Germany and parts of France at this time. Popes who followed Urban. Urban died in 1099 right before Jerusalem was captured. He died before hearing the news that Jerusalem had been captured. Pope Urban, his successors, those who come after him, do not follow his attitudes towards the East, but rather they would follow the logic of the Crusaders themselves. And I'm going to read to you a short passage here from Aristides Papadakis' book, The Christian East and the Rise of the Papacy. He has a section here. This is a copy of a letter, a portion of a letter from the Crusaders, from the First Crusade, a letter that they sent to the Bishop of Rome after their successful conquest, I believe, of Jerusalem and of Edessa and of Antioch. So they write to the Pope, "What there seems more proper in all the world than that you meaning the Pope, who are the father and the head of the Christian religion, should come to the original chief city where the Christian name was used." They're speaking of Antioch, because they had conquered Antioch, the city of Antioch. And remember, in the Bible, it's in Antioch that they're first called Christians. That's what they're referring to. So they're saying to the Pope, you need to come to Antioch and bring to it a conclusion on your own behalf, the war which is yours. For we have beaten the Turks and the heathen, but we do not know how to defeat the heretics, the Greeks, the Armenians, and Syrian Jacobites. We therefore continually entreat you, our dearest Father, that you, our Father and ruler, will come to the city which is yours, and that you, who are the vicar of St. Peter, will sit on his throne, and then you will find in us obedient sons, acting rightly in all things, and you will be able to root out and destroy all heresies, of whatever kind they are, by your authority and our strength. By your authority and our strength, you will destroy all heresies. And those included in heresy are the Orthodox, are us. We're the Greeks. And that's the attitude of subsequent bishops of Rome going forward, unfortunately. The exporting of the papal revolution to Constantinople then becomes a major goal for subsequent popes. The result of the First Crusade is that there is a permanent entrenchment of schism between the East and the West. Not a unifying. Pope Urban thought that this would help unify the church, but rather it entrenches schism and the distrust of both sides for the other. In the West, the Crusaders depict the empire of Constantinople as devious and treacherous, and that any subsequent losses that they would face at the hands of the Turks would be blamed on the emperors of Constantinople because they didn't help them, or they were in league with the Muslims. This was how things would be blamed. And so in the West, the attitude of the, in a sense, the propaganda from the Crusaders back home is very negative about the Roman Empire and about the emperors of Constantinople. And this very much embitters the people in the West towards the Christians in the East and creates this very much us-them distinction, dichotomy, that we're not the same thing anymore. And that the Orthodox are just as bad as the Muslims, basically.
Do you think that stems from the very beginning when Pope Urban was like, why am I not a part of this group? And when he didn't submit, or whatever the reason for not sending it back, or he didn't get, do you think that's the trigger to all that?
Mm-mm. It's the Crusaders who create this opinion. Urban is very positive towards Alexis.
But then the Crusaders.
But the Crusaders are not. Right? The Crusaders are not coming out of piety. Some of them are, but not the nobility, really. The nobility are coming to take territory, and to create kingdoms for themselves. And they're taking it, in a sense, from their fellow Christians in many ways, or at the expense of them. Urban wants them to help, whereas, in a sense, the Crusaders, they don't help the Roman Empire in the East. They harm it. Their actions lead to its end, ultimately. The Islamic Empire in the East is not harmed by the Crusades significantly. They're never a serious threat to them as an empire. They take small sections of territory that are of symbolic value, but they never threaten them as an empire. But what they do, though, threatens the existence of the Christian empire, the Roman Christian Empire in Constantinople, for their own gain. And that's why the Orthodox look at them, they call them often the Franks. Because again, remember, the Kingdom of France is largely involved in this, and the Holy Roman Emperor, which is modern day Germany. But these are all kind of, that group as a whole are of, in a sense, Frankish descent, in a sense. The Franks are Germanic people. The Franks were the ones who came in from what is modern day Germany as a Germanic tribe. They settled in what is modern day France. They speak French, which is a Latin language, but as a people, they're a Germanic people. So as a way of referring to them, the Orthodox at the time called them the Franks. And they're seen as greedy, lawless, lacking discipline. And this is the general sense. They're not to be trusted. They make oaths and then they break them. And this pattern repeats itself in the second and the third, and especially the fourth crusade. So after the first crusade, which ends in 1099, you have the preaching of the second crusade. Largely in the West, he is considered a saint, Bernard of Clairvaux. And himself, Bernard of Clairvaux, had a very negative opinion of the Orthodox and of the Roman Empire in Constantinople. And that he blamed Constantinople for the loss of Edessa. So in 1144, the kingdom of Edessa, the first Crusader kingdom established, is lost. And so Bernard of Clairvaux preaches for a crusade to go retake Edessa. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of the Holy Roman Empire and the Germanic principalities, they take up the cross and go on crusade. And the crusade was a failure. They're defeated in Anatolia, And the loss is blamed on Manuel the First, Komnenos. He's of the same line. He's a descendant of Alexis. Basically saying, oh, it was Manuel. He conspired with the Turks against us. But there is no actual evidence of this being real. The Third Crusade then is in 1189 to 1192. This is led by Philip II of France and Richard I of England. That's Richard the Lionheart of Robin Hood fame. This is the period of Robin Hood now. And Frederick I of the Holy Roman Empire. All three of them go to retake Jerusalem because Jerusalem had fallen in 1187
Fallen to who?
to the Muslim armies. They retake Jerusalem. They only accomplish the recapture of Acre and Jaffa, but they failed to recapture Jerusalem. And this is interesting. This Third Crusade is very interesting because one of the people who accompanies the fighters is a woman named Eleanor Aquitaine, wife of Philip II. She will eventually divorce Philip or be separated from Philip by annulment because she only gives birth to daughters for him. And she will then marry the Duke of Normandy, who will then become King of England. And she will give birth to Richard I, the Lionheart, and his brother, John, who in Robin Hood stories is the bad king, you know. But she is from France, and her desire in her letters, we have some of the things she wrote. She desired to stay in Antioch and not go back to Western Europe because Antioch, she felt, was the place to be. It was a cosmopolitan, large city, whereas in the West, she had not found anything like it, which gives you this picture of how things are different East and West at this time. The East is where the big cities are, where in a sense, the intellectual life, the arts, and so forth, very much is richer, more going on, and so forth. As well, at this point in the West, cities are smaller. Things are very much more provincial, more narrow-minded, and so forth. And that's kind of this period. So in terms of the things that we're familiar with, you know, Robin Hood and the stories surrounding this, this is the time period of that. But also, it's out of the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine that the code of chivalry starts to emerge as well. So all of these things are kind of tied together. More could be said about that, but we don't have time. The Fourth Crusade then is 1202 to 1204. It's called by Pope Innocent III to retake Jerusalem because the Third Crusade failed to. And initially, the desire was to attack the armies of the Muslim armies in Egypt and weaken the armies there, and therefore be able to then go and retake Jerusalem. They never got to Egypt. The Republic of Venice contracted with Crusade leaders to build the ships that would move the force. But the leaders of the Crusade overestimated the number of soldiers who would embark from Venice, and that in a sense, the army that appeared could not pay the price to Venice. And so the Venetian Doge, the person ruling Venice, Enrico Danadolo, he proposed that the Crusaders would back him in attacking the rebellious city of Zara, or Zadar, which was a Catholic city. It was a Catholic city, but it was a part of the Venetian Republic, but it was in rebellion. And so the Doge wanted it back. And so he sent the Crusaders to get it back for him. And because they did that, the Pope Innocent excommunicated all of them. Okay. They attacked that city in 1202. The city was brought under Venetian control. The Pope was upset and excommunicated them. In January of 1203, as they are still en route to Jerusalem, the Crusader leadership entered into an agreement with the Prince Alexios Angelos of Constantinople, who had been deposed. He had been deposed from being emperor, and he made an agreement with the Crusaders to come to Constantinople and install him as emperor by force against his father Isaac II Angelos, who was emperor. So he was trying to, in a sense, take the throne from his father.
Why didn't he just wait?
No, I'm sorry. It was Alexios Angelos was trying to get his father restored, basically, because his father Isaac II had been deposed as emperor, and then they would add support to the invasion of Jerusalem. So the main Crusader army reached Constantinople. Then in June, in August, following the siege of Constantinople, Alexios was crowned co-emperor. However, in January, he was deposed by a popular uprising and deprived the Crusaders of their promised payment. He's no longer emperor, so he can't pay the bill. Following the murder of Alexios on February 8th, the Crusaders decided to outright conquer the city itself. And in April of 1204, the Crusaders captured and plundered the city's enormous wealth. Remember, Constantinople was the richest city in the world at this time. And they looted it. And there then was created the Latin Empire of Constantinople. And so some will conjecture this was not the intention of Pope Innocent. It's clear that it wasn't initially. But Pope Innocent did not take much time in crying over what happened. He installed a new patriarch of Constantinople, who was a Latin bishop and who recognized his own authority as Pope. So what had been done in Antioch and in Edessa and Jerusalem, purging the hierarchs of Orthodox and installing Latin bishops in their place, is exactly what then took place in Constantinople, under the approval of the Pope. This Latin Empire of Constantinople will last until 1261. Basically, the Roman Empire based in Constantinople fractures into three parts. And then there's this Latin Empire. And then one of those parts will eventually kind of pull everyone together, and they'll take back Constantinople in 1261. But it returns as a weakened, much more weak empire. The Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221, is called again by Pope Innocent III to retake Jerusalem and again defeat the Sultan in Egypt. This is led by Andrew II of Hungary and Leopold VI of Austria. So the nobility, the kings of Europe, are very much involved in this. They all answer the Pope's call to go on crusade. They did land in Egypt, but they were defeated. The Sixth Crusade of 1228 to 1229 is led by Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor. Again, this is the Germanic Empire. He had promised to go on the Fifth Crusade, but he was too late in participating in because they were defeated too quickly. And he had promised to take up the cross on multiple occasions at multiple public gatherings, right? So a nobleman would make this promise, like a legate of the Pope would come and preach crusade, and the nobles would get stirred up and they would say, yes, I will take up the cross. But it wouldn't happen immediately. And so, in a sense, names were kept. And the popes would go, well, you made a promise, and pressure would be put. And so Pope Honorius III starts knocking on his door with legates. Frederick, why aren't you taking up the cross and going on crusade? I have a crusade for you to go on. He never follows through with this during the time of Honorius III, but then in the time of his successor, Gregory the Ninth, Frederick is basically put into a corner, and Gregory the Ninth excommunicates him for not taking up crusade, the cross.
That's pretty rough.
Eventually, Frederick does go to the Holy Land, but without sufficient forces, and he is able to negotiate the return of part of Jerusalem or some of the territory of Jerusalem to the Crusader kingdoms. But this is not satisfactory for Gregory the Ninth, who calls for the Seventh Crusade, in a sense, to expand upon what had done at the Sixth, I should say, another crusade. This is called the Barons' Crusade of 1239. And so Gregory the Ninth called for a crusade in France, in England, and Hungary, with different degrees of success. And so although the Crusaders did not achieve any glorious military victories, they used their diplomacy to successfully play two warring factions within the Islamic Empire against each other, and were able to gain more concessions than Frederick II had gained in the Sixth Crusade. And so, 2 years, the Barons' Crusade returned the Kingdom of Jerusalem to its largest size since 1187. But this crusade in the Holy Land is sometimes discussed as two separate crusades, that of King Theobald I of Navarre, which began in 1239, and the separate host of crusaders under the leadership of Richard of Cornwall, which arrived after Theobald departed in 1240. So additionally, the Barons' Crusade is often described in tandem with Baldwin of Courtenay's concurrent trip. So what I'm telling you about is not just the only things that were going on. The numbered crusades are the largest, but there were multiple smaller crusade from nobles that would come periodically throughout this whole period to the Holy Land, in a sense, to make a mark. Sometimes out of piety, sometimes out of greed. So Baldwin of Courtenay's made a concurrent trip to Constantinople to capture another city with another small force. This is because Gregory the Ninth briefly attempted to redirect the target of his new crusade from liberating the Holy Land from Muslims to protecting the Latin Empire of Constantinople from the schismatics, meaning us, the Orthodox. And so then the Seventh Crusade, 1248 to 1254, we're almost done, just to let you know, was the first of two crusades led by Louis IX of France. Louis IX of France led two crusades. And its aim, again, was to retake Holy Land by attacking Egypt. And it was conducted because the Kingdom of Jerusalem began to see losses in 1244, and Innocent the Fourth had preached crusade, not against the Holy Land, but he had preached crusade against Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, who still was excommunicated. His excommunication was never lifted by Gregory IX, I think. And there was this great conflict between Frederick II and the bishops of Rome at this time period. And so a crusade was preached against him at this time period. And so what you see is the idea of crusading, of taking up holy war, that the Bishop of Rome begins to direct this not just against the Holy Land, but to internal problems or heretics, like the Albigensians. And then also to the north and the east of Europe against pagans, people who had not embraced Christianity yet, like the Lithuanians. And so crusading takes on not just in the Holy Land, but also expansion of Christianity, of Latin Christianity, to the north and to the east. And then the last crusade towards the Holy Land, which is called Lord Edward's Crusade, sometimes called the Ninth Crusade, was a military expedition led by Edward, Duke of Gascony, who was the future King Edward I of England. It was an extension of the Eighth Crusade and was the last of the Crusades to actually reach the Holy Land before the fall of Acre in 1291. And the Ninth Crusade, Edward's Crusade, was not very successful, had limited victories, and they were eventually forced to withdraw since Edward was pressing concerns at home and felt unable to resolve all the internal conflicts remaining in the Crusader kingdoms. And by this point, the idea of crusade to the Holy Land had burnt itself out. And in 1291, the kingdom of Acre was the last of the Crusader kingdoms to fall back into Islamic control. And so, as conclusion, what does all of this result in? As I said before, the Crusades are the thing that solidifies the schism or sets the schism in place. And it does that based on the presumption of papal supremacy, where the Pope feels himself the supreme pontiff, the supreme head of the church, and the temporal head, able to dictate to kings to go to war. Along with the idea, or we would say the creation of the idea of holy war. That these things together are the things that divide the East and the West at this time period. The theological differences are a part of this, but these are the underlying papal supremacy and holy war are the things, are the, in a sense, the forces that implement these differences, that try to impose these differences, these theological or liturgical differences. And the people who, in a sense, are on the receiving end of the forceful acceptance of these Latin ideas are not very appreciative of this, and don't thank, in a sense, the Franks or the Latins for coming to force upon them these ideas like the filioque or papal supremacy or so forth. And that embitters the people in the East to the people in the West, and solidifies their, in a sense, rejection of all of these things and the continued schism, and still stirs up, in a sense, Orthodox Christians when they talk about these things, because it has such a deep kind of visceral, you were conquered by your brother, and it's like somebody comes into your house and throws you out of it and moves in and tells you this wasn't your house ever, because this is kind of the attitude of the Crusaders, that they themselves, are the rightful heirs of the throne of Antioch, of Jerusalem, and that the Christians living there are not. They're heretics. They are schismatics and so forth, even though they're the ones who have been living there and maintaining the Holy Land and the shrines and the holy places and so forth for 1,000 years, hundreds of years. And so this is what really cements the division, East and West, is the Crusades. And a lot of this is overlooked in modern scholarship or in kind of contemporary thought about, that the Crusades, are this kind of blip in history. But the crusading spirit, this idea of holy war, of the justification of war by the church, right, really destroys the fabric of Christendom. Not just East and West, but even in the West. Because the Pope ends up picking sides, one against another. And that eventually will lead to the Protestant Reformation. So the notion of a single Christendom disappears at this point in the time of the Crusades. And it will as I said, lead to further disintegration of unity in the West amongst Christians going forward. So, questions? Colin asked, didn't some apostles carry swords? You have a reference to that in the New Testament of Peter having a sword. But the understanding of that is that, in a sense, the apostles didn't then, after the resurrection, after Pentecost, the apostles don't continue that practice. They don't go anywhere with a sword. The early church in no way admonished people to in a sense, to use violence in their defense of their faith. They faced martyrdom. That's why we have the age of martyrdom of the great martyrs, because they gave their life for their faith. Now, the defense of other people, other innocent people, that it would be proper to defend other people, is always understood. That if someone's being, in a sense, harmed, it's your place to go and protect them. And so, so if you're walking in the street and on the opposite side of the street there's somebody being attacked, it's not proper to just stand there and pray for help, right? It's proper for you to do what you can to restrain the one committing the violence from harming the person being attacked, and to separate them. It's not seen as it's proper to then. It's not right to kill the person committing the violence per se, but it's right to use force to restrain the violence. And this is then understood as how we would justify. You take that from an individual context and you expand that to a nation. It's seen by the church as it's proper for a nation to defend itself from outside aggression. But it's not necessarily proper for a nation to act aggressively for its own greed against other nations. Those kinds of wars are not justifiable. Wars of self-defense would be justifiable, but not wars of aggression. So, but that an idea of a war of aggression as a holy war, this is a new concept here. So, Paul, did you have a question?
So would this be justified if the guy accidentally stepped on somebody's toe and then he just...
If it's an accident, no. You're not justified in punching someone because they accidentally stepped on your toe.
And then the guy who got the...
No, I think we have to stop. We have to stop at the scenario there.
Oh, pulled out his pocket knife and
No.
tried to
Sorry,
And you
no.
saw that. Would that be justified to just go up behind him and grab the knife out of his hand?
You would be justified in trying to restrain somebody with a knife from hurting someone else. Yes. And that would include using force. Not necessarily deadly force. If it really came to that, and it was seen as this was the only way to keep them from harming other people, then yes, but that's still seen as a tragedy. It's still seen as in a sense, to commit, to shed blood, right, is still seen as a tragedy, even if you're defending other people. And so in that instance, if I'll make up a scenario here, if someone came into my house and tried to attack my family, and I, in the process of trying to restrain them, killed them, everyone would understand that that was justifiable. But I'd no longer be a priest because I had shed blood. And a priest cannot shed blood. And so there is a sense of, yes, it was understandable that you did that to defend your family. But at the same time, there's consequences to being involved in the death of someone. And you can't stay a priest.
That'd be the same way if you were driving a car.
Same as if you're driving a car. You kill someone driving a car. Same idea. You're not legally you haven't committed murder, but you're still involved in the death of someone. And that's still tragic. That's still not God's will that people die. And that's still the Orthodox kind of attitude. And that's why war is seen as so grievous. No matter how you try to justify it, it's still grievous. And the thing to do is to try to stop the fighting, to find a way to cease the fighting. A ceasefire is always the primary objective of the church, to bring the fighting to an end, not to advance it, not to increase it, not to supply more weapons to it, but to try to somehow come to a resolution of the violence as quick as possible, because innocent people die in the midst of any kind of violence. And wars take on a life of their own, as the Crusade did. Pope Urban's intention was completely dismantled, and it turned into something of its own. And that's what wars do. They take on their own nature.
Do you think he saw that coming?
No, he didn't. I'm sure he was not pleased necessarily with it, but he died really before he could understand fully what had happened. So, any other questions? Paul?
When you said giving weapons, it just America's giving weapons to Ukraine.
Well, yes. Well, we're not getting into that right now. All right. So next week, the 10-year-old didn't like my answer. Next week, we will stay in the 13th century, the 12th and 13th century, and we'll be looking at the establishment of Christianity amongst the Serbs, and what becomes Serbia and the Balkans, this area, and how even in the midst of all this turmoil, the gospel is spread amongst the Slavic peoples, what we call the Southern Slavs, specifically the Serbian people. And we'll talk about Saint Sava of Serbia. Not Saint Sava the Sanctified, but Saint Sava of Serbia. So God bless you all.
Is that